thanks for having us. It's really good to come and talk through a kind of very demanding and satisfying project. We're going to give a quick introduction to our work, and then we've got a couple of questions, and then we'll go into talking about we wanted to give a whole overview of how a project like this works. So from sort of conception through to production, funding, and then also the design process, because Tabby and I worked really closely challenging the basic ideas of the original proposal of Discord, which essentially was a dystopian property viewing experience for 3 people at a time, led by an immersive sound feature, but within a built set of 3 different living rooms, contained by a corridor of oppression. But we'll tell you more about that later. I'm going to introduce myself very briefly. I'm Caitlin, and I'm doing a PhD, a practice-based PhD at UWE, and my work is looking into broadly the behavioural effect of sound installations, built installations in public space. But the theme that underpins all of my practice is about experiences, lived and political experiences of home. So Discord was, for me, a space to kind of open up a cultural commentary on the housing crisis, but also do that through the lived experience and ethnographies of individuals from across socioeconomic backgrounds. And historically, I've been a practicing artist for 10 years. I started my PhD last October, and before that, professionally, I was working on kind of public art installations. Bovis Homes commissioned me, working for local authorities as community engagement coordinator or artist, doing a lot of site-specific events and built things. So that's the kind of background. I also set up an award-winning food waste campaign. So the themes that have run through my practice really are centrally organised around economic and social justice, and that's enough from me. So I'm going to pass on to Tabby.
Hi everyone. So I am an architect, and I did the whole thing, so I managed to get my part 3 eventually, which I'm sure you'll all do too one day. And after that, so I worked for several different architecture practices, specialising in sustainable design. I also worked at an eco-centre in Wales called the Centre for Alternative Technology, and learnt a lot about sustainability there. But for the past 5 years, I've been freelancing, and being a sole trader, I found myself doing more art installations and temporary structures at festivals. So I worked for Greenpeace for 6 months of the year, designing their field at Glastonbury Festival. So I really like working closely with builders and artists, and I'm really interested in how space can change the way people behave, and experimenting with different designs of space and really seeing how people respond to different installations. So it was really great to work with an artist on this project, because it just cross-disciplinary projects, much more challenging, and you just learn a lot from working with people from different backgrounds. So yeah, I hope this is relevant to your studies, and it was certainly a challenging project because it's all about housing, and we all need to live somewhere, and we all struggle with the economic situation we find ourselves in and the choices we make. So yeah, we're going to talk about that now, and Caitlin's going to ask you some questions.
Well, firstly, I have some assumptions because you're all students, but I just wanted to ask quickly, show of hands for people that are renting at the moment. Okay, so that's probably to be expected. And I just wanted to ask, who of you expect to own a property in the next 10 years? You know, it's a big question.
It's a lot less.
Okay. And can I ask why those of you that don't raise your hands, just a couple of you, why you would not expect to own your own home in 10 years' time? There's a mic.
Okay, so I think for me culturally, we don't really. I come from Jordan, so the idea of owning a house or buying a house isn't really in my thinking, and actually what you end up doing is building your house. So until, I mean, my parents are in their 60s and they still rent, so it's kind of, it's
And
what's done
that's
for
in
me.
Jordan?
That's in Jordan, yeah.
And are the rents capped as a kind
No.
of... No. And what would you roughly say the sort of percentage of if you have an idea of an average salary in Jordan?
Average, sorry?
Average salary in
Salary.
Jordan? Like you don't need to tell me, but if you equate roughly how much do you think people are spending on rent monthly once they've got their take-home average?
Probably 30-40%.
Okay.
So I'd say about 30% of their
Yeah.
income.
Yeah. So anyone else got any reasons why they might not be owning a home in 10 years? Very optimistic first chat.
Architects don't get paid enough money.
You are?
Architects don't get paid enough money.
So you can organise a union lobby at the end of this. So I've got a few facts here. In 10 years, the average house price has gone from £186,000 to £288,000, and that's an increase in 10 years of 55% of an average UK house price. And roughly here, it's interesting that you said 30%, because in the UK, the national averages in London are absolutely distinctly different. But the average UK salary is 25.5 grand. That's from 2013, a bit outdated. And that if you're in the rental market, you're going to be paying 40% of your monthly earnings on rent, averagely. And at the same time, let me just get my statistics correct here, 66% of private renters on that sort of salary at present are saying that at the end of each month and each year they can't save anything for a deposit. So I'm just using these very optimistic and relaxing snapshots to say that we are in a real problem. And the problem is that if people don't have inheritance or they don't have a kind of a sort of pass-me-down nest egg or a significant chunk of money from parents, the disparity between those that can afford and those that are stuck in very overpriced private rental markets, while the social housing, what used to be half 50% market rents for secure social housing for low-income earners, is being squeezed. So I'm an artist that's really interested in political issues. I used to belong entirely to sustainable food waste and economic justice issues, and recently housing just became such a pertinent issue. So I'm not an economist. I worked with economists on this. We work closely with an economist. I'll have a bit of a chat about his research in a minute. But I just wanted to open with some sort of economic insights into the reality of access to affordable housing. And I think perhaps as architects, if you're thinking about how we can also really plug into a really intense need for increased housing stock, and also what sort of housing initiatives you work on, I wonder if you think this is part of your work, or as if sort of emerging architects, you would just, you take any job for housing stock. What sort of housing do we want to be building and for whom? So that's kind of a bit of a background. So, love to have questions at the end. And if there's any really pressing questions, just raise your hands and we'll stop and have a chat. So I'm going to go through that's the mic, the presentation. So I was in the library last week and I was just accidentally walking past an archive box of Icon. And I saw this on the most recent edition. And I just thought that was an interesting comment on responsibility and thinking and policy around who's designing and who's building what sort of housing stock and for who. And I'm not an architect, I'm an artist, but that is on a very recent issue. It's the October issue, I think. So I wanted to just include that in a cultural observation in passing. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how this project came about, because I wanted this presentation to talk about the issue, but also give an insight into sort of how architects and artists work in the real world and what a commission looks like. So hopefully this is useful. So Ruth Potts was one of the main curators for Utopia 2016, which was a kind of cross-large art institute collaboration in London. Can anyone tell me why Utopia in 2016 has been and is such a popular theme? It's like a really famous text by someone, so that might help. Okay, so Thomas More wrote Utopia 500 years ago. And if you read it, it's a really quick read. It's like Penguin Classic, £5, really easy to read. And he proposes that no one owns individual property, and that people have very, very kind of a lot of leisure time and a lot of agricultural time, a lot of community time. When you get married, you do have to have a chaperone observe your future spouse naked. So I thought that's quite funny. But his ideas are really, really radical in terms of looking at wealth redistribution, the distribution of land in particular. And so Somerset House, British Library, ICA, quite a few other academic institutions, King's Cultural Institute and King's College, London, have all been investing in a re-examination of ideas around the traditional first idea of utopia, which was obviously an island that didn't exist, so it liberated us immensely to think around solutions to day-to-day, older constraints and contemporary constraints. So we got a call out. I'm going to try and be quick. Do you want to do this? Yeah. That was phase 1, got a call out. Phase 2 and 3, we went and did open space, which is a really interesting process. I'd not done it before. You get in a room filled with strangers. There's an organising process. In this one, it was that you have basically time to write your idea on a piece of paper and you situate it on an object, and then you're told that you're either pollinators, bees, or that did you have settlers? There was another one as well. Hosts, yeah. So if you've got an idea, you host it. It's kind of like conceptual speed dating. And if you don't know what you want to do, you fly around the room and you visit the host and like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Tell me what you're doing, like 3-minute pitch. And then you have your settlers, people who are coming together and going, right, what skills do you have? You're an architect, you're a sound engineer, you're a film producer. Wicked, let's make some sort of immersive audio-visual installation. So very quickly, these ideas are just popping out. And the aim is to try and like free up the creative resource and skills within a room and also build quite rapid new relationships. So this is how the first phase of the commission started, which I was super excited by, because normally it's a massive funding sheet or a big bit of writing, and this was very much embodied and relational. So I met these two people there. That's Victoria Johnson. She's head of marketing and brand at Sound of Music, which is the UK's leading sort of sound and new music commissioning body based at Somerset House. This is James Wood, who's an economist, a third-year PhD candidate at King's College, looking into how the dominant ideal to own your own house, which is, as you said, I can't remember your name, sorry, that in Jordan it's not the dominant ideal to be an owner-occupant. Is that correct? Yeah. So he looks at, in the UK, why the dominant model culturally is to own your own house, and how this is actually a disciplinary financial constraint. You are disciplined by the labour market, forced into long-term work to buy something you arguably can't afford, and there's very limited alternative, especially with the squeezing of social housing. So that's his research, and he was the big economic brain behind a lot of the questions that came up. So that's team building initially. Then we're working with, actually the three of us wrote a bid together then, once we had found each other through open space, and we got commissioned by King's and Somerset House to make a new piece exploring housing security, and Sound of Music were also a main partner. The reveal. So the budget was really small. It was £5,000. It was like, we're going to make a CD. Like, what? And that was always the offer. So it's £5,000, and it's like, okay, we can't really do very much. So we're thinking already, how can we get more money? How can we get more funding into the project? And then at the same time, we need some more skills, because we're thinking about building something already, a structure. So Tabby, she's got a different hairstyle now. Being an architect who, I guess we know each other socially first and then through sort of professional projects as well. So I approached Tabby, and then also Luke Harney, who's a producer, a composer and a DJ, because as I mentioned before, my work is very much looking at the effect of sound, and I use sound a lot in my work. So then we're building this big team. This is what's happening. Phase 4, we're going to production, which means that we're not ready to start doing stuff. We need to figure out how to get more money. So basically make loads of Gantt charts and loads of plans about all of the tasks we need to do and how we're going to fund it. And I make an application to the Arts Council, basically. And I think if you're ever interested in doing a project where perhaps there's not an obvious commission, is that the Arts Council is a really good resource to get small grants to test ideas, and then you can get larger grants. So this is where we just made a big application to try and get more funding, and we got it. So that was the kind of, I'm giving you a quick whistle-stop tour for the project shape. Next one, more boring Gantt charts. We got some Arts Council money, so that meant that we could build this structure. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough funding to, what I would say is to allocate all of the workers on the project a kind of decent salary. And I think that's a real struggle when you're working in a freelance capacity, but also with your own ideas. It's really tough to have the right fee, the right salary for everyone, and enough of money to build the thing. So they gave us £12,000. We had a total budget of 17 grand. And I just want to be totally transparent and give this information to you as a sense of how these things happen, because I think that's quite useful. So design development, I'm going to hand over to Tabby to talk about how, once we've got the basic resources, the commissioners, the venue, the partners, the money, we go back to the drawing board and we rip pretty much everything apart that we'd put in the funding bid. So I'm going to give this over to Tabs to talk about this space.
Yeah, so Caitlin invited me to take part in the project. So she wrote me into the funding bid, and then when we got the okay from the Arts Council, then I was able to actually start working on it. So this was probably about 9 months before the exhibition. So we met up, me, Caitlin, and the sound designer, and we had a brainstorming day where we just explored lots of different ideas, kind of trying to get to the bottom of what is it that the piece is trying to do. And you all know kind of about design process. You just throw loads of ideas out and then you see which ones float. But what the key themes that Caitlin wanted to do was, I'm just going to show some kind of precedents, is explore different types of housing form, but also different classes. So we came on the idea of having some kind of common space where which would be representative of public space, and then smaller rooms around it, which would be representative of different homes. And so you have the relationship between different homes, different economic backgrounds, and then a common kind of forum almost, where people can come together. And once they've had different experiences, try and find a shared common ground. Because one of the important themes Caitlin was really keen to bring forth through this installation, I was asking her, like, what do you want people to think or feel afterwards? And she just said, I want people to talk or to actually discuss these issues. So we needed to provoke people, but also give them a space to kind of reflect. So some of the original ideas that we didn't do, because of budgetary constraints and space constraints, but somehow playing with scale or heights of ceilings, so you get a sense of different spatial kind of norms with different types of homes. So yeah, you've got classic 1960s social housing in London, and then newer kind of high-level private dwellings that are separate in the countryside. It's a very different experience. We were also really interested to look at class, because it's something that British people tend to not like talking about or thinking about. But Grayson Perry was a strong influence, because with his tapestries, he makes a lot of references to the aesthetics of class and what objects people have in their homes, what kind of signifiers do you tend to see that allude to a certain economic or social status. And then, so we were trying to think what's the minimum amount of furniture or pictures or even details, window frames, door handles, that would give you a sense of different experience of life. It's quite a touchy subject, because we didn't want to be stereotypical. You don't want to be offensive to anybody, whatever background they're from, but we also wanted to explore this from a material perspective. Doors were also something that we felt was a strong theme. because even just a front door can tell you a lot about the building or the people that might live there. And also, Caitlin, meanwhile, was interviewing a lot of people, and she went around social housing in Bristol, and a lot of the council flats, your home is, you enter through a door and a long corridor of 20 other doors. It's not so grand an entrance, and we were inspired by this sense of like endless doors and not knowing what was behind them. So the first kind of design that I worked up was the idea of all under one house, one roof, a kind of typical drawing of a house that a child would make. You enter through the front door and you're in a corridor, a dark corridor with endless doors, and it's very dark, and you have to find your way to the different rooms. You open them, you go in, and the idea was that in each room there would be an audio installation with interviews. So Caitlin was interviewing different people from different backgrounds, and you would hear their stories in the different homes. So that was an idea with the doors. Another thing that changed through the course of the project was that originally we wanted this to be outside on the terrace in front of Somerset House by the Thames, and it would have been amazing to be able to build something outside in the public realm. But because Somerset House is listed, we would have had to do a planning application, and we just didn't have the time. We didn't have time to submit the planning application before, and not knowing whether we would be able to or not was too much of a risk, because if we didn't get permission, then we would have had to find another space. So in the end, we had to go inside the gallery, which I think Caitlin was disappointed by, because she really wanted it to be available to anybody, as if you're just walking down the street and you see this thing, you go, oh, what's that, and go in. But sadly, we weren't able to do that, so then we had to change the installation so it would fit within the constraints of a room in a gallery.
But you could only get to for a warren of corridors
So yeah,
on a ground floor level, so you had to carry everything, just,
downstairs.
access.
Somerset House doesn't have a goods lift, so yeah, the whole set had to be carried downstairs. So this is the final layout. So people would arrive at the front door, be given 3 sets of keys, and it's like a property viewing, and then they would enter through into the dark corridor and move around until they found the right door for their key and enter into each room. Shall I talk a bit about the rest of the installation? So then after each person has gone into each room, then everybody goes into the central courtyard room, which became an auction room, and they were forced to bid to buy one of the properties that they'd seen. And that was a kind of mechanism to make people think about their own choices and whether they could afford it or not. And it was quite an impressive experience. So yeah, in parallel to the development of the design, Caitlin was doing the audio interviews.
Shall I?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to quickly pick up on a couple of things that Tabby spoke about. It's really worth bearing in mind when we're thinking about an installation like this. Key terms are sensory aesthetics and immersive environments, and also I work with a docufiction approach. So the whole content, materially speaking and spatially speaking, we really wanted to represent kind of class identity and explore what class identity meant in terms of being able to afford and access housing. And it also sets up a really interesting opportunity because it's for 3 people at a time. I don't know if we said that. And it means that as people are going through what is ultimately set up as a property viewing, we'll talk about that more in a minute, the narrative of the experience, the narrative of the space, they end up in this bidding room together at the end, pitting against each other by the way the narrative is presented through the disembodied voice of the estate agent. So within this space, there's a narrative that's playing out, there's a sequential story, and that's coming through inbuilt speakers that convey the audio. And within that, each room, when you put the audio headset on, you're listening to stories, real stories, ethnographic studies of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They earn different money and have different levels of security, talking about how they access housing. And we've got a social housing tenant that has grown up in the same house for 62 years, in Hartcliffe, and who doesn't own her property and has really reduced rents and has lived there, I mean really lived there for a long time. She gave birth to her children in the same house she was born in. It's a really interesting in-depth voice of kind of living within social housing. And then we had someone who's from a very roughly middle-class background, had some inheritance, could afford to buy, felt very politically conflicted about her privilege, but could ultimately afford to buy a house in being a young professional. And then we had a much older person who has multiple properties and speaks very freely about investing a property in the 90s in London and then her bigger property in Sussex, and thinks of it as a really difficult privilege, but doesn't really acknowledges within herself that she will take the opportunity to see a huge revenue generation from selling her portfolio of properties. So that just needs to be kind of borne in mind, is as you're in these rooms, it's spatial and it's architectural, but it's also very closely woven together with the narrative experience. And I'm going to link into the sort of research aspect of this project, because it's social realism. It's fictional, but it's based around lived stories, ethnographic studies of people's relationship to housing and home. So this is me interviewing someone. I interviewed 20 people. It took that, in terms of project timing, took a long time to find a good cross-section of people from a range of different backgrounds. And how I ended up finding the hardest group to access were long-term social housing tenants. So I went through Bristol County Council social housing team and met up with a lot of two main members of staff there sort of 3 times and spoke at length about the project, and then they introduced me to some of their long-term tenants, and I went around to their house and had a chat and saw if they were interested in talking to me about their finance and their lived experience and the shape of their home and access to home. So obviously there's anonymity and there's ethics and stuff like that going on at the same time. While the ethnographic studies, the sort of lived stories of housing and housing security are coming on, I'm working very closely with Luke, and we're thinking about how the narrative structure plays out within the space, because we've already got the design pretty much agreed. So we're thinking, how do we create an immersive experience within this environment, led by audio, but very imbricated with the physical environment? And as Tabby said, things like door handles, architrave, windowsills, these became really, really important things in terms of detailing how we actually spatially and through a representation of home give description to these subjects. This is a map of thinking through how what became a 32-minute experience is structured, and I'm working really closely with Luke at the same time, who's composing musical scores to respond to the interview content that, while I'm going out and doing these 20 interviews, I'm editing them down and passing them to Luke, and we're figuring out what the musical tone is as well. So there's a really big auditory and audio aspect here. These are sketches with like these sticky bookmark things in my sketchbook when I'm on the bus going, how do I structure this narrative experience that's going to be really embedded within this built environment? So as you can see, the corridor of oppression. At this point, Tarim from Pervasive Media Studio, he's a technologist and he's got a history in kind of gaming theory. We bring him on as a paid member of the team to think about whether or not we're going to use movement sensors. Do we want the audio to be triggered by people arriving in the space, or are there going to be audio cues so they just pick up the headset? The sound system in itself was really complicated because you've got 3 people in simultaneous rooms having independent audio experiences, and then you have to predict everyone's behaviour, that they leave the room into the corridor, go to the next property viewing, but they'll be hit with the kind of matching audio at the time when they roughly leave. So there was a lot of timing and testing issues to go through as well in terms of behaviour. This is a map of our audio system. So we're starting to think about, it's complicated because it was complicated. So we also managed to get sponsorship from Mini-Rig. So they gave us all of the Mini-Rigs, which was really great. And because we've got different sounds playing at different times, simultaneous times, there was a lot of, we had one channel, one interface system to play through different audio channels that needed to run at very specific simultaneous times. So it just means that we had interconnected all the speakers to run from one source, but that's a bit of a tech detail, but that was happening. Sound and Music are really interested in using their network of young composers, but also I was really interested in opening up the project in as many ways, as I could in terms of participation. So we put a call out to some young composers through Sound and Music to submit small samples or audio segments of their interpretation of the housing crisis. And we got amazing things like jangling keys and banging doors and a lot of kind of audio description of people walking down long corridors, and then sort of conversations about relaxed dinner parties happening. Very much lots of audio samples describing home. And we integrated some of those into parts of the audio. So that was a sort of later point opportunity that Sound and Music said, hey, we've got all these amazing composers, should we use some of it? So that's just a nod to another level of collaboration. We built the website because if you look into Discord, houseofdiscord.co.uk, the website's still up and it's got an audio on there. It's got a kind of a sting, and it's quite narrative, and it's where you could book, because people had to. It was free, but people had to book because it's such a time-based experience. It's about 33 minutes, and the commissioners wanted to optimise its running time. So we did 8 shows a day for 2 months. But to manage the flow of people had to book in advance. So, and that was that we didn't manage that. Somerset House and Kings actually managed that, but obviously we had to put a book here thing. We also were put on this really interesting website that's just, I think it's, go and have a look, it's the Utopia 2016 website. I think it's really postmodern. It's incredibly discombobulated deliberately. It's really like, it looks like something you might have seen in the 80s. And I found it hugely ironic because this is the image, the digital image of Utopia. So anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. And then we're going to go briefly onto the key concept that came up later, actually. So for ages, for about 2 months, we were having was it bi-monthly meetings? And we're developing the idea in the space, but we're like, what is the thing that holds this together from a user experience? What are they going to do? They're coming to walk around these properties. What is the invitation? So we figured it was going to be a property viewing, but quite late in, and that would be how we would invite an audience to be observers into documentary of home and go through this environment, but also ultimately have a chance to be an author, to bid, to interact with the piece. So then we invented a fictional estate agent called Discord and Sons, and we worked with our web designer to do kind of branding on the property brochures. We had a bidding card. Just quickly to describe how this worked, actually. When you arrive with your booking for your property viewing, you'll get given, there's 3 of you. You might be friends, you might be strangers. You get given a lanyard of keys, 3 keys. You get given your property viewing brochure, and you get given your viewing, which is a full description of each property, and each door was in accordance to these numbers, and each room matched the description on your prospective viewing brochure. You're also given a viewing card. This is key to the experience working. So people have to go in the right order, but independent orders, around the 3 properties. So when they arrived, the gallery assistants all got trained, and they were the estate agents. So they go, welcome to your 12:30 property viewing. You've got 3 keys each. You have a property brochure, and you have a viewing card. If you don't remember anything, keep the keys and stick to your schedule. Good luck. So that's what they're met with. And you can see that everyone does the same thing, but they do it in sequential order, because otherwise you've got 2 people in one room with 1 headset, and the whole journey gets messed up. And actually, people mostly did it. We did get people trying to kick the red door down a lot. That was interesting behaviour. That was really interesting. So that's the viewing card, and this is all part of the pre-narrative, the preamble that you are now at a property viewing, and you will be invited to bid. So the other interesting data that came out of this, I'm really interested in how people interact and experience built installations and sound installations, is that people, when they did go through the red door, which was unlocked at 28 minutes in by the assistant, and until that point it's locked, and people like red doors, they really tried to open the red door. It's like Crystal Maze, open the door, and it's locked, so it's just kind of a lot of banging. And that was interesting. And so when they've been in the bidding room, which is their point of the experience where they all come together and they're all invited to bid on their preferred property, they talk to each other, and they have to bid. There is a box you can choose where you can choose not to bid, and there was a submission box on the wall which they posted it through, and I got 412 of these with really interesting comments. So it's like fascinating actually, and I haven't yet started to analyse it, but that's a really great outcome. So now I'm gonna. That's the red door.
So this is the door that you go through at the beginning of the.
But the blue door's closed, isn't it?
Yeah.
First.
And you're in a dark corridor, and then
with 3 other people.
Yeah, and then this is one of the properties, number 14. This was in Walthamstow, Terraced House.
Near a nice pub.
This was a much grander property in, where was it?
Fitzrovia Georgian townhouse.
Yeah, and you can see the headphones there next to the chair. And that was the council flat, which is, as you can see, a lot smaller. But we didn't want it to be just necessarily, it was crapper, so there was a lot more kind of cards showing that whoever lived there was loved, and they had fresh flowers, and, you know, just not trying to be judgmental about people's quality of life. And then this was the auction room, so at the end of seeing all 3 properties, you're then headed into the auction room, and you're forced to bid on one of the properties you've seen and put the card in the.
And a key quick thing on that is until you're given the cue in the corridor, make your way to the red door, there's a narrative that gives really clear cues. It's been locked. And the other kind of design feature point is each room has a window that is frosted and shows this light, but you're not allowed into this red door until very at the end. So given these kind of material and spatial cues, you look through the window and you're like, what is through that window? Each room has this window. So it's kind of like, you know, there's something coming, but you don't know how to get there. Well, you probably know it's through the red door, that's why people try to kick it down.
Behind the scenes. So this is on top of the installation. You can see all the wires, which were for the speakers and also the headphones. So it wasn't censored, it was all on a time basis. So the minute people went in, press play, and then the whole thing ran kind of sequentially. There was a bit of freedom, so if you picked up the headphones, it started from the beginning, so there's about 2 minutes of leeway, and that was the complication, is that people walk at different paces, some people are really quick, some people are slower, but you want to give the people the feeling that it is actually interactive, that it's not just, because we had a lot of conversations, well, we could have it on a loop, but then I hate hearing a story from halfway through. You want to hear it from the beginning, and you want to be able to hear the whole thing. So this was the actual pre-build. So we built the set in a workshop in Bristol first to test it, because we wanted to even out some of these complications. So the whole set is built out of flats. Each one's 4 foot by 8 foot high, and so it all stacks up. So we built the whole thing, took it all down, put it in the back of a massive lorry, drove it to London, carried it all down the stairs, and then rebuilt it.
And we even made the flats ourselves.
Yeah, that's us moving a flat. So it was quite a mission.
That's some of the flat pack stuff.
That's most of the set out in the street outside the workshop in Bristol. I wouldn't advise doing this normally. I think it's better to, you know, build it once instead of building it twice. But we only had a 2-day kind of get in at Somerset House because it was a gallery space, so we didn't really have an alternative. But you know, once you built flats, we basically sold them on free cycle because they're really useful, standard size. A lot of sets for theatres are built in this way. So that was the set going up in the gallery space at Somerset House. And we ended up having to get quite a lot of helpers to do the set dressing at the end because there was so much to do. So that was the ceiling going on, and that was kind of a momentous moment when we'd finally finished it.
Before we dressed it for a week, though, the build was done.
Yeah. And we got a lot of freebies as well. So we got all the wallpaper was free. You know, you have to do a lot of ringing around. It takes a lot of time, but you can get materials for free, but you've just got to put the legwork in. And then this is a little video.
Yeah, we thought it'd be interesting before going to questions, just a quick time check. Oh, okay, cool.
We don't have time.
I think.
Thank you.
Would you like to see? It's like a 3-minute taster. It's shot on a GoPro, so. Oh,
Welcome. Thank you for arriving promptly to the Discord & Sons property auction. We are pleased to announce 3 diverse but equally charming properties for your consideration. Each entirely desirable in its own right, provides an excellent investment opportunity for you and your family. During your appraisal of these prime examples of real estate, do consider which one you would like to invest in and how this might affect the shape of your future. We all have to live within our means, but we look forward to some spirited competition in the auction later. You will be bidding today. If we're all ready to go, check your viewing schedule, make sure you have your brochure to hand, and make your way to your first property viewing. Good luck. Ladies and gentlemen, please make your way to your first viewing. Your first property is displayed on your viewing card. Once you've found the correct door, unlock it and make yourself at home. Make sure you attend the viewing alone. Remember to shut the door behind you.
So that's just for bearing in mind, I would like to have some questions. That's just a brief taster. And I had a GoPro gaffer tape to my chest, so you have to bear in mind the kind of, we're having we'll have a film released in the next sort of 3 weeks by a professional filmmaker. So if you want to, and there's a whole documentation of it there, if you do want to have a look at what it might have been like. But we've got 10 minutes, so it'd be really good to get some questions. And yeah. Yeah, you can see there's a website, so if you want to follow up or if you want to see the film or have a sense of what the experience was like, do have a look. It's houseofdiscord.co.uk.